differential equations in social media. So y'all just hold tight. I'll be done in about 3.5 hours. We'll take a break, and then I'll talk about my watercolor. So I'm Robin Hagemeyer. I do live in Dripping Springs. I've been there 23 years. I married my husband for his land. And we have 2 boys and have raised our boys there, and so we're empty nesters, which is pretty cool. And I've been painting really most of my whole life. I show in 3 galleries right now. I show in Fredericksburg at the Good Art Company. I show in Park City at the Thomas Anthony Gallery, and I show in Taos, New Mexico at Selden Creek Ranch. And I do want to reiterate the importance of framing or mounting your artwork professionally, because I have been to shows where you can tell someone slaps it in it looks like they got it framed at the Kerville Airport Hair Care and Frame Center or something. So, so you do want to really spend the effort and the money to frame it professionally, because you are showing off your art, and especially if you want to command some decent prices for it. And someone else mentioned pricing your art in a gallery and how you have to add so much to it. I want to make it clear to people, if you're not aware, you keep your artwork prices consistent no matter where it is. If it's in a gallery, if it's on your website, or you're selling it to your grandma, your prices should always be consistent. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't give grandma a bit of a discount, but if a gallery ever finds out that you're undermining the prices, then they will drop you like a hot potato. So keep in mind that when you pay a gallery 50%, a lot of people, oh my gosh, that's ridiculous. But you have to keep in mind they have overhead. They're paying for the building, they're paying for the staff, they're paying for the advertising. That portion you pay them is the sales portion of that painting. If you sell it yourself and you market it and you put forth the effort, you get to keep that portion of the sales price. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a bit of a mind shift, because it really is kind of hard to wrap our head around that when you're going, I'm giving away 50%. Well, best thing to do is just market the crap out of it yourself. So I love painting in most everything but oil. Watercolor is my first love. And I wanted to demonstrate this technique, which is a really loose abstract background. And then I come in with some detail on the faces of the animal, and I even incorporate my pencil work, because I like having the drawing work there as well. Some of these I may have actually painted in transparent acrylics, which I use a lot. And golden makes the best ones. The viscosity is really thin, and I like to use freezer paper as a palette. So whether I'm using acrylics or watercolor, I prefer to squeeze the paint out out of the tube, because the colors are more intense. So these act like watercolor, they move like watercolor, they have that just beautiful luminosity like watercolor, but the disadvantage, you can't lift out, so when it's there. But the advantage is you can go in and layer and go over it without worrying about muddying it. And then you can go put white over the top of it. So the one thing that you do have to do, I'll paint these on watercolor paper, 140 pound. I tend to like, what paper do I like?
Arches.
Thank you. It's the mind read here. What paper do I like? Should have caffeinated up a little better before I came here. So I like arches particularly, but I use watercolor paper, but what's going to happen if you don't gesso the paper first, when you stroke on that acrylic, it grabs it and sticks. So you do need to gesso if you're going to use the transparent acrylics, but they really do have a beautiful vibrancy. You don't have to tend to go over them as many times as you do watercolor. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to work on 2 at once. I've gotten this one well along the way. So what I'm gonna do is while I'm showing the process here, I'm gonna do the detail there, and hopefully by the end of our 4.5 hours, it'll all be done. And so what I do first is I spray, I mean, you can look up here down there, I spray just not saturate, but spray it with water. And
that's after you gesso?
no, I'm working with watercolor, so I did not gesso it. Gessoing it takes the watercolor a little differently, so I really wouldn't do that. So I'm going to do what's called an underpainting. Is everybody familiar with that? Okay. It's usually a fairly good idea to do your underpainting in somewhat primary colors. Don't have to. I almost always put a little bit of green into it. But I usually use about 3 colors. You don't want to get too crazy with it. Maybe if you use a 4th, just a little bit. And so what I do, and some of you may have used these. I had a teacher once that called them a spirit card. We made these crazy spirit cards of just splashes and strokes and then cut them up and then use that as an underpainting guide. I don't really do that now, but what I do is I just maybe make, can y'all see that?
Yes.
I make just some strokes of color, random, some wider, some thinner. Now I know my longhorn, this is a young longhorn that I'm painting. I mean, who doesn't love a calf, even if you're an Aggie? So I did not go to UT myself, but every man I've ever loved did, including my son. So I put at least one of them through and married another and then put my kid through. So hey, I'm a longhorn fan when it comes down to it, right? So he's gonna have a lot of white in him. I really love this process for paintings or for animals that have really clear, cool markings to them. I just think it makes a more interesting painting. So I'm just gonna put a couple of different colors on here as an underpainting. And then I'm gonna spray it again, just to soften up some of the strokes and the lines. Maybe let it run a little. If there's a hard line that you don't like, you can soften it up a bit. But it adds really interesting things happening that normally would not be if you did not do these sorts of things to the background. And it kind of helps the painting where you don't even really have to do as much finishing off the background. So you can let it run both ways. And then I'm just going to set that side aside and dry. And that's the first step in this technique. So then what I did after that, so here's my photo reference. Everybody can see that. Is it better if I have it down here? Y'all are all in the splash zone here. You're just like, in fact, that reminds me what I did not do, what I love to do is put some splash marks on here. Just gotta have a few of those for interest. Oops, again, I'm probably gonna get it on that one. It might actually add to it. Okay, so we'll let that dry. So then what I did next is I came into the dark areas, like the ears and her body and her ears, the little calf's ears, him or her, I'm not sure which. And I took some really intense paint and I came in and I just painted in, like I really loosely, just kind of blobbed in the dark areas of that calf, where their ears, the eyes, and then I sprayed it and let it run a little bit again. So on this guy, can y'all see this picture? I need to spread out here. Thought I'd work on 2 at once. Okay, can you see that? Okay, so on this little guy here, he's got some pretty distinctive marks in the face and the ears and his spots. And so I'm going to come in and put some really intense color there. I usually might let that dry a little bit more. I'm going to use some of my real wet paint right out of a tube, so I'm using quinacridone, burnt orange, and quinacridone gold. So those tend to be my favorite Longhorn colors.
That Daniel Smith?
Mm-hmm. Love Daniel Smith. So I'm just gonna come in and kind of loosely put in the dark areas of this, just like really not even.
So you don't wait for it to dry?
I usually wait for it to dry a little bit more, but you don't have to. I'm compromising my underpainting a little by doing this, but I promise I won't charge you extra. So. It's a little red, but oh well. When, I had an art teacher in high school, by the way, who was a genius. She just passed away at 92 years old, which I went to high school when I was 30, so. She was amazing. She gave me the best piece of advice that I remember to this day. She said, never use black. Black is boring. It doesn't do anything for your painting. Pick another color, like a dark blue, dark purple, anything like that. So as you can see on this one, I don't have any black on there. Everybody knows that's a black cow. I don't have to explain it to them, but it's so much more interesting to have blues and purples and other colors. So now on this one, I'm gonna put it up a little bit because I've blocked in some of those darker, and I'm just gonna spray it a little bit because I kind of want it to run down some. And if it starts getting real streaky, you can kind of wet the bottom a little bit. Who's doing the floors around here? All right, now I do want that to dry. So I am going to just set that aside, and hopefully that'll dry enough for me to work on it, and I'll come back to this one. All right, so that's what I did on this one, is I let that run. You can see a little bit of it running down, and then I started coming in with detail and really doing the darkest. When I paint an animal, what I love to do is start out with the eyes and the nose first, because that's their personality. I mean, you know, you can't have a smart-ass jackass without, you know, the nose and the eyes. As you can see, I love painting jackasses because we all have a few in our life. So that one is called My Jackass Neighbor. I am not naming names. I am not. But we all have one or two of those. And the other one is called Adopted, and it is an actual spotted jackass that lives on my country road and has that little goat with it all the time, so I call it Adopted. And this one, I take all my own photos for the animals. This one's Billie Jean, and she was one of the local Dripping Springs residents. And then this one I call Bo Peep. So I'm going to show y'all how, when I am done with the painting, to mount it onto a canvas. And you do not have to use frames or device for your watercolors. And the nice thing is, it's waterproof. You can squirt it with a water bottle and it's not going to ruin it. This is also a method I use in a clear acrylic float frame. So when you mount it on the wall, if you have a pretty color wall, then you see the wall through it. And that's another nice way to mount watercolors without frame and glass. We've kind of found in the galleries that the frame and glass look has kind of fallen by the wayside a bit with people. It's just, people kind of like that gallery wrap canvas look and not have to have the expensive frames if they don't want the frames. And I find that invariably, if I frame it, they want it in something else. So these float frames, which I'm going to show you how to use these, are awesome. They are not offensive to anybody. They go with almost everything, and you just mount the canvas in there and you see the edge of the canvas. So I'm going to show you how I use those. This is one of my favorite looks, either doing it like this where the paper's mounted on the canvas, or I put it in a float frame, and that's really the only frames I use anymore. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can finish this one up really quick. So I've got in almost all of the detail, and I have some of the shadowing I need to do still for the calves. shadows in the body. And I'm gonna put a little bit of that in, figure out, so the colors I'm using here are primarily the yellow ochre, actually raw sienna, and some of the darker blues, and maybe just a little bit of quinactidine orange and some purple. So when you paint, don't introduce just something altogether different. You know, try to stick with those and let them mix. It's all over the back of the background of the painting and in the shadows, and it'll just have just a more, what's the word I'm looking for? Congruous? Cohesive. There you go. And here I was going to go into differential equation.
Yeah.
So a little bit of some shadowing here in the calf.
And this is dry? Is that you're
This one
working?
is completely dry, yes.
And this is watercolor on top of acrylic?
No,
No.
I am doing just watercolor for y'all today.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the cows in the background are watercolor? Did that whole thing?
Everything's watercolor, yes ma'am. And so what I'm doing is I'm dropping in several of these colors at once, but as you know, you drop them in maybe off to the side a little bit so you're not muddying things up, and things then can granulate together and mix on the paper. And again, this is just the shadows. I'm not really doing spots. I'm getting in some of the wrinkles, and then I wet my brush and along the edges just kind of go along to soften that up a bit because I don't want those edges hard.
You never stretch your paper, you just paint on the paper flat?
No, I used to when I was younger. I'd kind of stick it on, tape it onto a board. There really isn't much need for that because it still does its thing. So what I do in order to flatten paper, and a lot of y'all may be aware of this, even after I've done this and it gets real buckly, I will turn the paper over and I will wet it with a sponge of water. Just soak the back, I press it between two pieces of cardboard and just put something heavy on top, like my sister-in-law. So, and then it doesn't take long, really just a few minutes, because actually the cardboard, you want to make sure it's clean, of course, kind of absorbs a lot of that moisture and it flattens your paper perfectly. And that's what I do before I mount it, because as you can imagine, if this paper's like this, it's not going to mount very well.
So you put it between cardboard, no freezer paper, or?
No, you don't have to, as long as your cardboard's clean. I just sandwich it in between that and I put a toolbox or something heavy on top of it, like my bathroom scale. And just leave it there, and that's a depressing piece of equipment, isn't it? Bathroom scale.
Mine's been unfriendly lately.
Yours has been where?
Unfriendly.
Unfriendly, mine has too. How many more of you women are trapped in a societal prison of unrealistic beauty standards? It's definitely more of a woman thing, I'll tell you that. Impossible beauty standards. I actually heard that from a comedian on Sirius Radio, and she was talking about living in New York, and there are feral supermodels everywhere. She goes, they just come out at you around corners with no warning whatsoever. And then that's when she said, I am trapped in a societal prison of unrealistic beauty standards. And I'm like, I have to remember that. I like that. Perfect. So then when I spread that shadowing around with some water, I can then kind of go back into it if I need to a little bit, or if I want to drop know, like maybe some purple in the darkest parts of this little guy here. Looks like there's some shadow in here. Usually my workbench is up to here. Do many of y'all paint standing up or do you paint sitting down?
Transitioning into standing.
Depends how big it is.
Yeah.
I feel like I need to get above it. So my workbench is about right here. And my husband's always saying, well, why, your back hurts, why don't you sit down? And it's not the same thing. You know, you gotta feel like you're commanding it, right? You're taking control, which God knows with most watercolor, you don't have control, but that's kind of the beauty of it too, you know, as it does its own thing. So, I think that looks pretty good as far as the shadowing on that little fella. So, a lot of this is just really the underpainting showing through still. So I like, you can do the white, so the white of Mama here fades into the white of the little guy, and the white of the calf fades into the background, so it's here. So this is where I you can do one of two things. I kind of like using the pencil to then come in and just work that, which is what I've done on these. But also what I can do is now start refining the background a bit. So if I've decided, one of the things that I don't like about it the way it is her body has a lot going on. And so that's okay, but it's not really the focal point. So I had an instructor once that said you don't want too much happiness in a painting. So you want to have a focal point, and in this case, to me, it's their two faces. It's almost like you really have two focal points. So I don't want a whole lot going on with her body that's distracting. I love the blooms, I love things that are going on. So I'm going to get it just a little wet, lightly, and I'm going to drop a little bit darker color into it so that I still have something interesting, because again, I could try to, so since she's a black cow, you're not going to see all this little detail of wrinkles and things in her body that you would if she were a white one. Plus, that's not my focal point. So I'm just going to mute that down a bit by mixing a little bit of some dark. So I don't have much in the way, what I would normally do is put it down here, just put all that watercolor down here, because again, it makes it more intense. Most of my watercolors are dried up in the tube, because I haven't used them in a while. So what I do, and this is a hint if none of you have ever done this, if they're solid dried in your tube, just cut it open with an X-Acto knife, peel the metal off, and take that cat turd inside, put it on your palette, and just put some water on it and mash it down. And I mean, because watercolor dries hard anyway, right? So there's no point in throwing away all of your tubes of paint just because you can't get them out. Cut it with a utility knife, peel it off, and that's what I did to every one of these. Almost every one of my tubes were dry. And so it's good as new, obviously, when you rehydrate. Kind of like our wrinkles. Okay. Anybody have any questions or comment?
Question.
Yeah.
When this is on finishing, do you sprinkle or anything once you have to do a piece to a canvas?
Yes, ma'am. And I'm going to go over that process with you, but I'm glad you asked. That gives me a little something to go over while I'm doing this. So what I do when it's dry is I spray it with 3 coats of a fixative or a varnish. And I brought a couple of them. This one's a Krylon crystal clear acrylic coating. What you're basically going to do is turn your watercolor into an acrylic for all practical purposes. So I spray it. I spray it once, I lay it on cardboard, spray it once going horizontal, vertical, whichever way, let it sit a few minutes, I spray it the opposite direction, go off the edges, and then I come back and spray it again. And that is the first thing that I do, and then I mount it onto my canvas, which I'll show you how to do in a few seconds. And then after that, I go over it with a acrylic satin varnish, and I put a couple of coats of that on there. So basically now it's just completely encased in acrylic varnish. So that's why you don't need glass. That's why I can spray it with this water bottle and it's good. And I find people tend to like the look. I mean, some more traditional folks will still kind of express interest in wanting a frame, and I just go, you can take this canvas and take it to the Kerville Airport Hair Care and Frame Center and have them put something on there. So it's not as though they can't frame those thicker canvases, and then they can choose. Because like I said, I just find every time you try to put, some really cool frame on something, people go, well, I love everything but that frame. Can you change that? It's like, here we go, and you've already spent money on that frame, and then they want another frame. I say, yeah, it's gonna cost you extra. What if I want it without the frame? It's going to cost you extra. But why? Because now you get to keep the frame. Yeah, but I got to go through all that work to unframe it. Now you've irritated me. And so, no, it's all cost you more. And then they just fine, I'll just take it. And they just go on and on about it for a while. They'll give up. So now I've deepened that a little bit on the mama cow and let it run and do a little bit there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is the background is a little bit not really quite where I want it. So I'm going to deepen some of my drips. I want the background to be a little drippier. It's good for now. Yeah, that's kind of more of an issue with us watercolorists, is you gotta keep the water a little cleaner, but I'm not really dealing with white right now, so I'm not too worried about that. So I'm gonna come in and define the ear just a little bit. She has a highlight right there. And I'm gonna stop it right here because that defines the back the calf a little bit better. A little bit of purple in there, and then I'm going to just give it a little bit of a spray along the bottom and the edge right there. And I'm going to let it just run a little bit. And if you want, if you don't like the little drips on this guy, but it almost kind of gives it a little more definition in the wrinkles, you can dab it off. I'm going to do the same for the little one's ear here a little bit. And what I'm also doing by doing this, I'm not only defining those white edges a little bit, put some yellow in there too. It's making the background a little more cohesive. Get my little English language going here. Pig Latin is my primary language, so that's why and so see that already is made, their faces pop a little bit, it's kind of made the background a little nicer. And then I think I want this one. Is that better? I'm not used to painting with these mirrors. Last watercolor group, or last group made me paint vertically with watercolor. The audacity. I know it's funny, I was like, vertical? I thought I had a camera, and they're like, yeah, So what I want this one to do is just run off the top of it this way. Oh, sorry about that. So I'm kind of liking that. I think I like most everything about it except maybe this corner a little bit. It's kind of a bright spot with that pinkish purple, so I'm just going to dumb it down just a little. So you still see all that through there. It still adds to it, but it's not distracting from it now, I think. And again, just going to spray that bottom edge a little bit and let it run. And anything else that I want to do with that, I can do in pencil when it dries. Okay, so I'm going to set that one aside, and I'm going to come work on this one. This one's a lot drier. It's still a little damp, but
Excuse me, pencil, you mean watercolor pencil? Or?
no, I'm just going to use a graphite pencil. Like I did on these. I'm using a really, just a nice high quality sketch pencil. You can get them in different softness. And have any of you ever used the water soluble graphite? That's pretty fun. And the problem with this is, well, it's not really. You can use that water soluble graphite, which is kind of nice because then if you want to go in and just sort of soften some of the edges, you can. Because then when you spray it with the varnish or the fixative, then it's not going to run. I've done it before and didn't think about it and then hit it with a brush and it just like smeared. So you just have to remember if you're using the water soluble or not.
When you start spraying, does that change the intensity of your colors? Can you tell a lot of difference?
It can, which is why you have to go in a little bit more like I did on the body of the female. But I'm really kind of almost spraying almost the edge too. So in other words, I'm not spraying the whole thing again, but maybe where I did the dark, I'm spraying that bottom edge because I want it to run a little bit.
Now say that again, I wasn't following.
Well, so when I was spraying like that paint, I was spraying in the direction I want it to run.
Oh.
So if I put it, like I put it around the ear, can you see here? So I put it and almost outlined a little bit of that highlight around her ear. So I put a hard edge there and then sprayed it so it would just run down. And then I did the same thing up here. I did kind of hard edge, turned it upside down and sprayed it just on that edge so it would run that way. Because I didn't want it to run back down in her face. So that's why I put a hard edge right here.
Yeah.
And then the same thing. So this one, the light still fades into the background a bit, but I like that. I kind of liked how.
Okay, what I was speaking of though is when you're spraying with the acrylic sprays and the Krylon sprays.
Oh,
Does
no.
that change the intensity? Not at all.
In fact, what it does is it makes the color deeper. It makes it richer, which you're going to like because, as you know, the watercolors dry a real matte, kind of faded look. And if any of you ever had a slate floor put down and then once you put that sealant on it, how rich the colors become, that's what this acrylic varnishes do for it. It really, to me, puts way more depth into the painting.
But before you continue looking, can you show us some of the ones you finished, where you used the pencil?
I used it on this one, all the little curls and curly cues on the sheep. I don't know. This one I did a lot more of it, so you're welcome to come up. And by the way, any of these paintings are for purchase if somebody wanted them, and I would give you all a discount of 15% if y'all liked any of them.
But would you reframe it?
For extra. Absolutely, there's a price on everything. Oh, you're good.
Okay, we're turning it upside pencil on that.
Oh, sorry.
There.
I know I'm not used to using one of these. So on her, see, I did some of the pencil work on the horns, the face, a little bit of the hair. I did a lot on Adopted because of the spots and things kind of went into the background. So that was just for this series. You know, I don't always, on this donkey, on my jackass neighbor, I went about it all the same way, but I used the transparent acrylics and I came in with a little bit of opaque acrylic just to give it a little more richness. But all that background was done with just splashing paint and putting that underpainting and spraying and letting it run. And then when I finished him, his actual name is JJ. He is a resident jackass of Dripping Springs. And he is still living and kicking, and I tell him, every time I see him, I'm like, JJ, you are money for me. Because every time I've painted that jackass, it sells. And he, yeah, because he's a happy guy. And his owner told me that it's starting to get to his head a little bit. And he's, you know, thinking he needs to be running with the race horses now because he's all special. So I told him and gave him a big head about it, but.
Do those finishes that you put on there, do those actually paint the official, like a watercolor that is not actually a watercolor, like for a show or something?
That would be a good question.
It can. Some shows do not. In fact, most of the watercolor society shows don't allow varnish.
Okay. Yeah, I kind of quit doing a lot of the shows a while back, and so I've kind of lost what a lot of
But
them
I think that there's one or two that are kind of trying to come around because of the people that are painting on aquaboard. But Texas and
Wash
Wash.
they accept aquaboard.
Yeah. But I believe that, yeah, they do. So you have to check with each one.
Can you show us the photo, please? Yeah.
Thank you. Y'all gotta keep me in line here because I'll lose track of my space. So this is still a little more wet than I would like it to be at this point, but it's okay if it runs a bit, so I'm just gonna start putting in some of the dark details.
When you put in the back, underpainting, you said it's random, but is it really truly random, or do you keep like kind of composition in mind?
It really is kind of random. Like I said, I might avoid not putting a whole lot in the white part of their face, but there's still a lot there. In other words, I might not just put a big red streak across the face because I want all that background color to make that interesting. But I don't want it distracting. So in that regards, I might keep the darker streaks or brighter streaks through an area where they're not really there, but then, you know, when you start splashing paint, it is what it is, and it really does make it more interesting if you don't get too controlling with it. If any of y'all have any questions while I am doing this, feel free just to.
What colors do you use to mix your arts?
Whatever's on the palette, let's see. I don't have any of them labeled. A dark blue and some purple and some. Look, don't get all cocky out there, but you know, I do have my favorites that I use. I think some of these the labels came off. And when I was going through some of my tubes and dumping stuff, the label got lost because I was peeling it off and it was all gnarly. So I just kind of know that, yeah, there's a nice blue. And I use the cerulean blue a lot for the background because I like the way it granulates. And I used that raw sienna because I didn't want it quite as intense as the quinacridone gold. But the quinacridone color really, in fact, I think this crazy color right here was called maybe Moon Glow. Or maybe that's the blue. People just gotta make your own decisions about this. I can't be with you every step of the way. How's that for turning it around? Oh no! I think we all sort of have these favorite colors that we do tend to gravitate towards, but.
Did you sketch it first?
I did. So someone was asking me earlier if I sketch or trace. I do both. Here's what I do, because I tend to paint these animals over and over again. I draw it first on a small piece of paper because we all know it's just easier to draw it smaller than it is to draw it large. So then when I know I want to do a painting, like I've painted this one before, and I painted it quite a bit bigger. I did a 24 by 30 and put it in a gallery show. So I drew it small, and then I took it to a printer, and I figured out the percentage, like I need this blown up 246%, and that got me the exact size that I needed for my watercolor paper. So then they print it off, I put it up on my studio window, I put my watercolor paper over it, and I trace it. And that saves redrawing and redrawing and redrawing, and then when I wanted to do it this size, I figured, okay, it needs to go up to 156%. So I just had the printer, print shop, whoever, blow it up 150, because they can then blow it up on a piece of paper like this. Because I've done Longhorn paintings, I just finished one 30 by 60, and all I had to do was just tell them how big to blow that thing up, because it was a whole lot easier to draw it this big and get everything right than to try and draw and erase. And of course, doing that on watercolor paper doesn't work so well for us. You don't have to keep videoing if you don't want to. Just watch.
All right, okay. Unless you're gonna do something really good.
Unless I'm